My full name, Jeffrey Dean Nelson, and I was born in 1963. I was born in West Bromwich, here in the West Midlands. And life was very, very interesting. My parents came from the Caribbean in the 1950s. I am one of several children. I do mean several. And we were brought up in West Bromwich we lived on an estate, a typical estate in West Brom, separated from other parts of the black community, as it were. So we were brought up on an estate that was completely white at the time, and separated from our colleagues. Growing up, my parents were very strict. They believed that we needed to integrate in British society. So we had to speak the Queen's English, and we had to say what we mean and mean what we say. School life was hard and very entertaining. The behaviour of some of the teachers, questionable. The behaviour of our peers, even more so on some occasions. We did get into fights, quite a few of them. But yeah, it was very, 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 very interesting time. We didn't have a lot of friends, but because there were so many of us kids, we didn't need friends. We had each other, especially my youngest brother, who was our toy, much to his disgust. Educational, my opinion is that for me, teachers had very little expectation of me. I think you were expected to excel at sport, but you weren't expected to excel educationally. The way in which the system was set up, we were in sets. I wasn't in a particularly high set. And I do recall saying to a teacher that I wanted to learn a foreign language. I wanted to learn Spanish. And they says, "Oh, you're not clever enough, so you're not going to do it." And written off educationally like that was hard. I was speaking to somebody earlier about maths, because one of the things that I used to find was that I could work out mathematic problems in my head, but I was never able to show what the working out was on paper. And so I was continually marked down for that. It was just a general feeling that I had at the time that nothing was expected of me. I wasn't expected to go on to do anything. I wasn't expected to go on to achieve anything. Irrespective of what my parents would have wanted for me, it was seen as beyond my abilities. Probably home life had to do something to do with that as well. My parents weren't always the most positive of people, and they would say that you lack ambition, or you lack this, or you lack that. But I realized, with the benefit of hindsight, they were trying to be harsh because they were trying to put us in a frame where we could expect what is going to happen later on in life. We weren't told much about Britain growing up, but we were expected to conform. We were expected, my parents, they're from Jamaica, but we weren't allowed to speak patois. We had to speak the Queen's English all the time. My father had high expectations. And he actually did national service in the Royal Air Force. And he spoke very, very highly of it. He spoke highly of the people that he met. My father was seen as almost like a stand-up person in the community. So we weren't given anything negative about England, but we did see plenty negative in life. Back in the 1970s, obviously the National Front as a political party seemed to be on the rise, and there was a lot said about people going back to the country of their birth, being given £1,000 by the government to go there. So we did see that. And the experiences that we had in the street with some people, with some of the people at school, reinforce that. So whilst people turn around and say, did I have any negative experiences? I had plenty of negative experiences. But it didn't, I didn't feel that it was representative of everybody. Yes, it did. One of the things I always wanted to do, I always wanted to please my father. Yeah, and he told me about going into the RAF. He told me about going on the back of a motorcycle, and all these things that he told me that he did, I wanted to do. So from an early age, I decided that I wanted to go into the Royal Air Force. And with some early pictures of me, people used to say that I used to stand there, always to attention. I didn't feel it was true. But when I look back at some of the pictures, I think, oh, why am I standing like that? But yes, my father, he was a supplier. He did his national service. He, I think, came to Britain in 1955, as of the Windrush generation, and joined the Royal Air Force to do his national service in 1958 and stayed until 1961. No, I didn't. I joined the Royal Air Force, and I think with the benefit of hindsight, if you're going to walk into a careers information office, you've got to have an idea of what you want to do. I went to the careers information office and I didn't have a clue because I just thought Royal Air Force pilot Royal Air Force, and didn't think beyond that. So of course, when I walked into the careers information office, and you do the battery of tests that they throw at you, and then they say, have you given any thought to what you want to be in the Royal Air Force? And you say, no. And they say, and then they start reeling off the different trades that you can do. And then whatever they're recruiting, they speak very, very quickly. And then they'll say, aerospace systems operator, pause. And then they'll start speaking fast. And you say, whoa, 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 what's that? What was that one? And you can almost see it on the face of the recruiter, and they think, gotcha. Right. And that's how I became an aerospace systems operator. I knew absolutely nothing about it at the time. You see, because if I go back a bit, part of the issue for me growing up, I'd left home because home life was quite harsh, and I ended up leaving home at 16. And the circumstances of my leaving meant that I had no educational qualifications. So it was a case of you're going to take what you can get. And I was just looking for what paid the most money because that's what I needed. In all honesty, boring, right? Because I'm more an outdoors kind of person. So sitting down in a darkened room, looking at a radar screen, wasn't my idea of fun. Uh, and that probably shaped some of my choices and behaviors at the time, which I don't know. Some of my colleagues in the RAF, they didn't like me and I didn't like them. So it was very much an us and them situation. Uh, I'm now on the base, uh, one of very, very, very few black people there, and experiencing some very harsh racism from the off. Where, well, as you can see, I'm not particularly tall. I wasn't tall then. I wasn't particularly big, so people thought I could be a pushover, and I refused to be a pushover, which meant that life became interesting, very interesting. No, it was fairly short training. It was well, after Swinderby, it was 6 weeks at West Drayton, um, And that was interesting. It was difficult to try and get my head around it, learning how to write backwards on a screen. And you think, well, why are we doing this? And the reality is that you're on one side of the screen, everybody else is on the other. You're being passed information and you've got to write it so that they can read it. So you write backwards, and so they're looking at it, can read it. So yeah, so the trade training, it was okay. The trade training was okay. And then you got posted to your first base, and then you get more on the job training. There were different positions that you would go to. They'd say either the tote or heights. Heights was my favorite bit, because if you were in heights, it meant that you were sat in a dark room waiting for somebody to call you. So you just got the opportunity of, if you were very, very tired, you could just relax until they called you. But otherwise, yes, it was it was a trade which, with the benefit of hindsight, I wouldn't have picked had I known exactly what it involved. Oh, well, general life, it was difficult. As I say, I wasn't particularly popular when I was at my first base at Neater's Head, and I was looking forward to getting away from there. And it was only in the last 6 months of my posting there that I actually met people who I would actually consider friends. But from there, I went on to Northern Ireland, and if I thought the racism was bad at Neater's Head, I was in for a culture shock, because in Northern Ireland it was so much worse. I was very much into sport. I did enjoy sport. I played rugby. I played rugby as a child, and I was representing RAF Bishop's Court, as it was then, in rugby. There I met a lot of hostility from other people, and it was all about race. People were openly racist towards me all the time. And as a consequence, I just shunned them all. All right, I was in Northern Ireland. I arrived there in February of 1984, and I was posted from there in November of 1986. So it's supposed to be a 2-year tour, but I extended for a year, purely because you got paid more money for being in Northern Ireland. And whilst I was out there, the kind of work that we were doing, radar, I did prefer it. That was one of my happier times, work-wise. However, there are certain things that happened in Northern Ireland that were particularly unpleasant, and I can regale some of those for you. One of the classic things was that this one year they had to paint the radar head. So the radar was turned off and we had to paint it with olive green paint. And I and others went up there and they did their turns painting the radar head. And then somebody, and I don't know who it was to this day, turned around and they painted my name on the radar head. And the thing is, even though the background was green and the paint that we were using was green, when it dries, it will show up in plain letters what has been painted on the radar head. So somebody paints my name there, and about a week later, I'm called into the boss's office to explain why I chose to paint my name on the radar head. And I said, well, I didn't. And they were insistent that I did. And I says, well, can you show me where I'm supposed to have done this? And they marched me outside and they pointed to the radar head and said, see, there's your name painted on the radar head. And I looked at that and I says, well, that's interesting. But if I was going to paint my name on the radar head, I know how my name is spelt, and it's not spelt with a G. So, yes. And that was when they realized that, no, it wasn't me, it was other people. And there were many examples of where people had done things to try and paint me in a bad picture. And it wasn't true. There were other times where one time I missed my flight back to Aldergrove, And I was told that if you just phone ahead, because it was a shuttle flight, the transport will wait for you on arrival. And I did just that. And they didn't wait because it was me. So I had to spend the night in the guard room at Aldergrove and catch the mail bus back the next day, which didn't turn up in the morning. It didn't come until the afternoon, which means that by the time I got back to Bishop's Court, I was now late. And I was charged with being absent from place of duty. Yeah, yeah, and there are, I can give you a lot of stories. One of the worst ones for me, as I say, I played rugby. And one of the things that happened in this one particular game, I was assaulted by a team member. He pushed me in my back. And he actually says, you know, because I went to catch the ball, I missed it. And as I'm walking away, he'd come up behind me, pushed me in my back and says, next time, use your effing hands. And I turned around and I looked at my team captain, who's just so happened to be my boss at work. And I looked at the rest of my team and I said, well, and nobody said a word. And I looked at the opposition and you could see that they were army and their jaws were on the floor. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was horrific. After the game, the opposition, they normally make a tunnel and everybody walks through the tunnel as they go off the field, but the opposition, they stood wide apart, so the whole team went through as one. I didn't want to have anything to do with them, so I was stood at the back. And after they'd left the field, then I left the field, and that's when the opposition, they closed up and everybody shook my hand. And I'll never forget that, because they didn't even come to the bar afterwards. They just went on their bus and left, which was quite unheard of. Leaving cost me a lot, but at the time I felt that I had no choice but to leave. As I mentioned earlier, when I joined the RAF, I had no educational qualifications because of home life. I'd left home and subsequently didn't do any form of formal education. Once I was in the RAF, I met certain people. One of them, a chap named John Clark, and one of the best people I've ever met. And he went for commissioning. And this one day, when I was in Northern Ireland, he phoned me up and he says, you should be here at Cranwell. And I thought, me, Cranwell? And I was so embarrassed because I had no educational qualifications. And I started thinking to myself, I ran away from home for a particular reason, to get away from certain behavior. And how long am I going to let that behavior control my life? So I stopped telling what I call my story of woe. And I thought, I'm going to do something with myself. And I started going to night school. And I got my O-levels. I did my O-level maths in 3 months. I did my O-level economics in a weekend. And I just started on an educational journey. Now, by the time I finished that journey, I was in a position where I had the required O-levels or GCSEs, and I could go for commissioning. And I went for commissioning. I did exercise first stage, which I won an award at. And I went to the Officer Aircrew Selection Centre, and I got through the 2.5 day process. At the end of that process, I was told that I was unsuccessful some weeks later, and I was to reapply in 12 months' time, which I was quite happy to do, because I thought it was a fantastic process, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. And then approaching Christmas of 1993, I remember my sergeant was chatting to me at work, and we were talking about the commissioning process. And he said to me, he says, how did you feel it went? And I was singing the praise of the Officer Aircrew Selection Centre. I thought it was fantastic. And he says, well, he said, did they tell you what you failed on? And I said, no, you don't get to. I said, you don't get to see the document. You're just briefed on its contents. And he said to me, he says, well, every year you get your annual 6442, which is your annual appraisal. He says, you're not supposed to see that either. He says, but what happens? And I said, well, you passed across the table. I get to read it. He says, so why didn't that happen with your report from Cranwell. And I said, well, did you see it? And he says, yes. And I said, look, are you trying to tell me something? And he says, yes. I says, well, come on, let's spit it out. And this is what he said, and I can quote this. He says, you get marked on positive and negative attributes. I said, yes, everybody knows that. He says, yours were tied, and so they wrote one in. And what they wrote in was skin pigmentation. At that point, I said, you're lying, right? And he says, no. He says, what happened? He said, I was in the boss's office, and he says, and the mail came in, and the boss said to me, he says, oh, Jeff's reports from Cranwell's here. And he's sitting there reading it, and he says, my God, that's naughty. And I said, what's that, sir? And he said, that. And he pointed his finger at the document on the table. This chap walked round the table and read what he was pointing at. And he says, oh my God, does that mean what I think it means? And he said, yes. And if they thought it, they should never have written it down. And it was at that point when I found out that, I thought, it doesn't matter how hard I try, it doesn't matter how hard I work, I am not going to get what I want because I cannot change the colour of my skin, and I wouldn't want to. And that is why I decided to leave the RAF. Yes, it was. My wife at the time, she did enjoy the military life. The profession I chose after that showed me a different side of life, and apparently changed me and my character. Subsequently, my marriage failed, and we went our separate ways. But yeah, it was hard. It was hard. I don't regret my new profession, not in any way, shape or form. I think it's one of the best things that could have happened to me. And you do see a completely different side of life. I became a police officer. That's what I became. And one of the great things about being a police officer is that if you identify perceived wrongs, you are in a position where you can do something about it. I have a very strong sense of morality, and I saw some things, put up with some things before being a police officer, and it was whilst I was in training as a police officer that a sergeant, a white sergeant, turned around and said, "You don't have to put up with that." And the manner in which he did that was quite unique, because we were in a classroom environment, and we were talking about sexual offences at the time, and everyone, it got quite raucous. And this sergeant, he turned around and he says, "Oh, come on, play the white man." And I looked at him and didn't say anything. I just thought, unusual, because it was just such an unusual thing for him to say. And then the day progressed and finished. And then the following day, we went back to the classroom, and the same sergeant came in, and he had a face like thunder, and he started ripping into us, everybody in the classroom. He said, "Yesterday, I made a comment that is wholly unacceptable, and not one of you picked up on it." And then he turned to me and he said, "Especially you." He says, "If you're not going to challenge racism, you are condoning it." And he says, "I expect you all to challenge it." And for that for me, that was the first time that somebody that thought, like, given me license to actually challenge things that people are saying. Yeah, which I thought was brilliant. Well, the instructor, he gave me license to know that I didn't have to put up with it. Not that I put up with it before. I didn't put up with racism. And as an example, when I was in Cyprus, one of the things I used to ride the motorcycle. And on one occasion, or on several occasions, I parked my motorcycle outside the police post at the entrance to the camp. And I'd come back at the end of my shift, and there'd be banana skins hanging on my motorbike, or bananas stuffed at the exhaust pipe. And I remember feeling quite annoyed by this because I knew what it was. It was just out and out racism, and I made a formal complaint to my boss about it, and he just laughed at me. So I thought, over the years in the RAF, the number of times that I've got into fights because of racism, and I thought, I can't keep doing that. And then you try and deal with it the correct way. You make a report about the racism, and then you get laughed at. I left the RAF. I became a police officer, and I'm told by a sergeant, you don't have to put up with that. And I think about that now, and I think, yes, maybe in the past my challenges weren't forceful enough. Maybe I didn't turn around and say, you know something, you may laugh, but I'm going to take this further. I don't think that when I was in the RAF, I didn't have anyone to turn to take it further, because the people that I was speaking to didn't take me seriously. Whereas in the police, yes, they did. It was it was good. As I say, I enjoy being a police officer. The I do remember I went to a briefing. There's a briefing I attended, and I was still a probationary officer at the time. And this one inspector, he was giving this briefing, and he asked a question, and I put my hand up. He says, yes, I answered the question. He says, correct, a coconut to the man in the corner. Right? And I thought, okay. And I waited. And at the break, I went up to this inspector and I said, excuse me, sir, I do not appreciate the comment that you made towards me. And he said, what was that? I said, the coconut to the man in the corner. I said, I find that highly offensive. And now this inspector was mortified. He says, oh gosh, he said, I didn't mean it like that. I do apologize. And I said, well, sir, I accept your apology, but my humiliation was public, and I'd like my apology to be so too. Right? And he says, okay. And after the break, as soon as everybody came in, he called the room to silence, and he said, I would like to apologize to PC Nelson. I said something that was out of order, and I do sincerely apologize. And I said, thank you very much. So, yeah. As a whole, it was great. It was it's had difficult parts. I mean, I did spend a lot of time escorting troublesome football fans around the country, which is why I don't like football, and I'm not a West Bromwich Albion supporter. I don't like Villa, and I don't like Birmingham City either. So I do not like football. But yeah, I spent a lot of time escorting troublesome football fans around the country, and the racism that some of them come out with, and they're trying to get a rise from you. But I did take great pleasure in arresting them for it. Okay, about the RAF, I'll start with the RAF. Right? What the RAF taught me was about resilience, right? Because, as I say, some of the things I suffered with in the RAF were quite horrible, and the number of times I've been put on SWO's working parties. Yes, yeah, I don't know if you know what SWO's working parties are. Yeah, I was always on them, and what I found was that people put me on it as a punishment, but I like the outdoors. So if they said, Nelson, go and put up that barbed wire fence, I'd do it with a smile on my face, right? And what I found is that when they realized that they couldn't get to me that way, when they couldn't upset me by giving me these horrible duties to do, then they started to leave me alone. So the RAF taught me resilience. The RAF taught me, if you're going to do something horrible, put a big smile on your face and do it anyway, right? The other thing it gave me the opportunity to do, it gave me the opportunity to educate myself. I left school without formal education. I have got myself educated. So it built in me the determination to do these things as well, to see things through, despite how difficult that they may be. So the RAF, yes, they were bad, but there was a lot of good. And with education, you can't take education away from people. The police, well, that gave me a lot of confidence speaking to people, meeting different people, knowing that the people that you are going to speak to aren't going to like you. They're not going to, I don't think I've ever met anybody who wanted to be arrested by a short black man, right? But there were several, and no, they didn't like it, but they all came with me. So yeah, the police, that gave me confidence in dealing with people, dealing with different situations, dealing with unexpected things. And also it put me in a position where I would speak to, sadly, it's young black males who were behaving in a way that is not going to do them any favors. And quite a few of them got a lecture from me. Not only did they get arrested, but they also got a lecture on how they should be carrying themselves, how they should behave. I would encourage them to join. And there are several reasons behind that. And one of the reasons, if I go back to part of my motivation for joining the police after I'd left the RAF, my motivation was, when you look in the media, what you see are negative stereotypes of black people. On the television, they were pimps, they were drug dealers, they were this, they were that. They were all the baddies of society. And I said, that is a poor interpretation, a poor representation of what black people are like. And so I wanted to join the police because I wanted a positive image of black people to be out there. And if you look at the statistics, I know I was studying social problems and social welfare, and at the time I think the statistic was black and Asian people made up something like 3%, was it 7% of British society at the time, but 47% of the prison population at the time. So I will say that justice can be colorblind, and what we need is that if we are to make a positive difference to the way society is governed, to the way the society is policed, we can't have people just sitting by on the sidelines shouting about how wrong the system is. We need people to join and change the system to shape it how it should be. Well, right now, I am what they call a casualty reduction analyst. I look at road traffic collisions, and with a group of others, we seek to determine whether that collision could have been avoided through education, engineering, or enforcement. And we speak with local councils and other partners to see what we can do to reduce the number of road deaths on the roads of the UK.